Welcome to Northwest Tech Show. I'm Dave Duncan, and this is a show where we talk about technology and how a better understanding of it can help you have better outcomes at home, at work, and in your civic engagements. We're going to kick things off, as we like to do, with a Creative Commons clip from the good folks at Twit TV.
This is Twit.
Not so cool was the news of last week's LastPass breach announcement, which, as I mentioned before, overwhelmed my Twitter DMs. So I wanted to lead with this because so many of our listeners, myself included, are using LastPass. So I had, as a consequence, also received an email from LastPass. The current LastPass CEO, and I say current because it's been jumping around somewhat recently, a guy named Karim Tuba, had the following to say in their online blog posting, which echoed the email that he sent to everyone. He said, "I want to inform you of a development that we feel is important for us to share with our LastPass business and consumer community. 2 weeks ago, we detected some unusual activity within portions of the LastPass development environment. After initiating an immediate investigation, we have seen no evidence that this incident involved any access to customer data or encrypted password vaults. We've determined that an unauthorized party gained access to portions of the LastPass development environment through a single compromised developer account and took portions of source code and some proprietary LastPass technical information. In response to the incident, we've deployed containment and mitigation measures and engaged a leading cybersecurity and forensics firm. While our investigation is ongoing, we've achieved a state of containment, implemented additional enhanced security measures, and see no further evidence of unauthorized activity. Based on what we've learned and implemented, we are evaluating further mitigation techniques to strengthen our environment. We've included a brief FAQ below of what we anticipate will be the most pressing initial questions and concerns from you. We will continue to update you with the transparency you deserve. Thank you for your patience, understanding, and support."
So note that there's not a categorical denial that anything like password vaults, it's just no evidence of.
Right.
So I feel like we're not completely out of the woods, that I'd like to know that there is, in fact, not merely no evidence of, but it didn't happen.
Okay.
I'm
Yes.
curious what you think about that. The other thing is, I think this is part of the Twilio breach, that this is a follow-on on the Twilio hack, which turned out to really be problematic.
It was pretty deep.
Because
yes.
so many people use Twilio for authentication and other, texting. And
So of course, we have the problem of proving a negative. So, lack of evidence isn't
True.
evidence of lack and so forth.
Right.
Okay, so the short version of the FAQ, I'm not bothering to share it all, but it was basically that they believe there is to be zero impact upon LastPass users. No need to change passwords, do anything, or take any action of any kind. And I'm sure they're unhappy that this occurred, since, I'm sure that they hold their proprietary information in high regard and don't want attackers snooping around in it. But we've always known, since I first checked out the technology that Joe Segrist originally designed, is that so long as the LastPass code that runs our local browser vault is not itself compromised, and that's the key. I mean, that's the golden goose. There is the script in our browser that knows how to decrypt the local copy of the vault. As long as that's not compromised, the only thing we're providing to LastPass, the only thing they have of ours to lose, is a very well protected encrypted blob of entropy, one from each of their users. That's what they hold for us in the cloud, which allows them to link all of our devices together. And I'm sure this is no longer unique technology. I don't know that it was back then. But, though I haven't looked, I would imagine and hope that's what every other password manager also does, because it's the only way to do what we all want safely. We know that LastPass uses a strong many-iteration PBKDF, a password-based key derivation function, which runs in our local browser to encrypt all of our password data before it ever leaves our local machine. So you need to have a good, strong password to protect your vault. If you have that, you're as safe as you could be. And presumably, adding any of their other security measures, such as multi-factor authentication, hardware dongles, etc., only strengthens things from there. But this leaves us with the question. With LastPass having admitted to having one of their developer accounts breached, should we change password managers? I was asked that directly by many of our listeners, and it's a worthwhile question. Lacking any additional information, and no additional information is available at this point, I think that's an emotional decision rather than a rational decision, which is not to discount it. I mean, you could argue that the human race is here because of the result of emotional decisions.
Oh, you could argue that trust no one is an emotional decision too, I guess, right?
Yes. So the reason I think that we need a rational decision is that, because there's no factual basis currently for knowing about what matters. To make an informed decision, it would be necessary to deeply understand the company's policies and procedures, like as an insider, and to know exactly how this particular breach occurred. They're not saying. Their policies and procedures would tell us how they have set up the barriers, which hopefully exist, between their developer resources and their production services.
Yeah, you hate to think that it's so easy that all we have to do is social engineer one person, and then it's all gone, right?
And Leo, just look at what we just learned about the way Twitter operates.
Yeah.
It's like crap. Okay, but then you would also need to know that same thing about the password manager you were considering switching to. Again, an emotional decision needs no justification, whereas a rational decision is only about justification. Now, I've always been careful to draw a clear distinction between policies and mistakes. Policies are deliberate. Mistakes, well, they're mistakes. When you're an employer, for example, and this is the example you and I've often used, Leo, and an employee screws up, do you fire them because they screwed up? Or do you consider that they made a mistake and have learned a valuable lesson from it? If as a consequence of having made a mistake, they're now a better and more valuable employee, why give them to your competition? So, unfortunately, we don't know enough about the inner workings of LastPass to make an informed decision about switching. Should we now be more or less afraid? How does their actual policy and behavioral security after this incident compare to the actual security available elsewhere?
Well, and there's an interesting comparison because it's believed that this same nation-state hacker who did the Twilio attack, we know DoorDash was attacked by the same guy. They say yes. Yep. But Okta, Signal, and LastPass all breached roughly the same time using similar social engineering attacks. So, the one who wasn't, but was attacked was Cloudflare. Remember this? You had this story last week, I think. They use YubiKeys. And because they use strong security, even that the social engineering attack worked, it didn't compromise them.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of thing I'd like to see from LastPass. Yes.
Right. And in his note, he was non-committal. I mean, he wasn't specific. He talked about, increasing their security and tightening their boundaries and things. It's like, okay, again, so we have an example, but again, to make a change, you need to know about where you're changing to just as much as you need to know about where you're changing from. So, if LastPass learned a valuable lesson, that's great. But I have no idea, and neither does anyone else. Their track record is all we really have to go on, and it's been good so far because the security architecture is good, and it's the security architecture that I'm relying upon. At the same time, as I said, presumably everybody else's security architecture is equally sound because none of this should be rocket science anymore.
Would you recommend changing your LastPass password at this point? Would that be a reasonable response rather than changing your password manager?
No. I don't see how that has any effect because it's the password which is used only locally to encrypt the blob which we send there.
They don't have access to that, or nor do they need it.
They never have. They don't want it, and that was Joe's original his original concept. So, if I were starting out today, all other things being equal, I would probably choose Bitwarden. Being
our
open
sponsor,
source.
We got to say.
Yes.
That's not why you're choosing them, I'm sure.
No. In fact, being open source, I'd be able to do the same sort of security architecture vetting that I once did with LastPass's designer, Joe Segrist.
Right.
As we all know, as you just said and reminded us, Bitwarden is currently a sponsor of the Twit network, and I think that's great. Though it's worth noting that LastPass had never been a sponsor here at the time I chose them.
Yes.
I chose
In fact,
them.
It was because you chose them, I think, many years later.
I figured
that they came to us. Yeah.
Yeah. I chose them because Joe was more open than everyone else, which allowed me to understand exactly how their system worked and why it was the proper design.
It's kind of ironic because if, in fact, what the bad guys got from LastPass is the source code, Bitwarden's open source, they got that already. Is it right? It's right.
And in a properly designed system, it shouldn't matter.
It shouldn't matter. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, many of the flood of DMs I received last Thursday asked whether I was still using LastPass, and if so, whether I was now planning to change. Security Now, podcast number 256. I love that it was 2 to the power of 8, was dated July 9th, 2010, and it was titled LastPass Security. The little summary description for it on Twit says, Steve thoroughly evaluates LastPass, explains why high security passwords are necessary, and tells us how LastPass makes storing those passwords secure. So it looks like I've been using LastPass for the past 12 years, and I still am. If they ever give me a rational reason to change, I will in a heartbeat. And whether or not Bitwarden is still a sponsor of the Twit network at the time, I would probably go there because openness matters. But, so does inertia and the devil you know. So, anyway, I'm still using them. I don't see any reason to change. Subject to additional information coming to light. There's never been a breach that affected our stored security because of the way it's designed.
Yeah.
And
that's what counts.
And that's really what counts.
Yeah.
And then it's a matter of looking at the pricing and the features and does it what suits your model best. I just never have a problem with it. So it's it's not irritating me.
And I have a very soft spot in my heart for LastPass, not only because of your support, and I used them for many, many years, but when they became the studio sponsor a few years ago, they kept us on the air through COVID. If it weren't for LastPass, I don't know if we'd still be on the air. So I have a very soft spot for LastPass. I do use Bitwarden. I like the idea of open source. But I think there's pretty much feature parity between most password managers at this point.
Yeah, and really, it's just inertia. It's there's no good reason for me to leave because it works. And when there is, I'll be out of there like in a hot second. But so far, so good.
And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. That was a Creative Commons clip from the good folks at twit.tv. That was Security Now 886 talking about the LastPass password manager breach. Or LastPass breach, not necessarily the password manager. So, so they got the source code. And I guess this does shore up the importance of a company having as little data to steal as possible. So, They may back up the encrypted blob that is your password store, but without your personal password, it has no value. Short of the ability to crack the passwords, which might be a thing. I think on a store that's only supposed to be local, I would think people tend to be a little less rigorous in picking out their password, especially since they have to type it in at least once every time they turn on the computer. So there's that. There's also, they didn't get into this, and for whatever reason, they don't seem to ever get into this too much, I guess because it's kind of like the problem that has no good answer. But if someone manipulated the development environment so that there was kind of a traitorous version of LastPass that got sent out to the users, then it could be set so, hey, when you type in your password, send a copy of the clear text password to bad guy, along with a copy of the latest version of the encrypted password store. And then they would be able to get into it. And the only solution I see to that is, not to allow automatic, this is the one thing maybe you should not allow automatic updates of. That, you need to know, like maybe you download it and you wait a couple of months and then you implement it, because in that time, maybe you'll find out, oh, there was a break-in, and so any versions that were downloaded between this date and this date are bad and should not be installed. It's like, okay, well, that'd be good to know. This is also kind of an example of one of the problems we have in tech, which is, all our eggs in one basket. Passwords are rough. There are some technologies coming down to get past passwords. There are security dongles that have a different code every time. Those are not really subject to having anything stolen from a specific server. Although the general algorithm that is behind things might be able to be taken. Or here's a list of serial numbers, and here's the password-derived keywords that come out of that serial number. So there's still some room for those things to be implemented in a bad way, but they don't have to be. So to the degree there's a lack of transparency on things, it's hard to trust it. To the degree someone rolls their own encryption, you definitely shouldn't trust it. A lot of these systems, they have undergone years or decades of being pounded on. And, here and there, they'll have a little research saying, oh, we've reduced the effectiveness of the effective security of a certain password by, 1 or 2 magnitudes. And it's like, okay, well, that's one or 2 bits off the password length, and you still, like, if you have 256 kilobit, passwords, that's like, okay, well, we still got 254, There's a lot of wiggle room there to have that and to still have it be effective. The thing that has come as close to ideal as I've seen is the one that Steve Gibson came up with, and of course no one adopted it because there's no commercial powerhouse behind it, was Squirrel. And that was based on an observation that given a certain input, you could derive a public-private key pair. That would be the same given an input. So, for instance, you could say, okay, I'm going to Amazon.com and I'm using username 1234magic, and then you take that plus a unique value provided by the local system, some just random bit of noise that the system knows as local and is always used in deriving keys locally. And you take those things and you combine them and you run them through a hash, which grinds it down to a specific key. And from that you can generate the key pair. You give them a public key, and that's all they have is they have a public key of a public-private pair. And the server does not know what your private key is. All it knows is, if it receives a proper authentication, that it can decode with the public key you gave it. For the most part, it's pretty secure. Now, again, it would have the same update problem. So if you had automatic updates, you could push out a corrupt version of Squirrel. And it's also kind of the finger in the dike program, where it's okay, you have this small player, and if they're allowed to become the hinge upon which all of the security infrastructure hangs on, then it'd be worth someone's while to break into Steve's house and change his source code. It's unlikely he has the kind of physical security that would be proportional to a major piece of what's protecting the internet, if that were the case. And it kind of calls to mind, there was a little bit of a reference to supply chain attacks, where, something that other services use gets corrupted, and then therefore they get corrupted. And it was interesting that they did mention that Cloudflare, that was using passwords and security fobs to protect their stuff. It's like, okay, well, you got the password by attacking these specific employees, but they are still in physical possession of their fob, and so you can't really log into their accounts. So this kind of remote attack would be useless against that. It would be, it'd have to be combined with someone who is willing to, go out and kidnap the employee or something. So it's good that we're having just kind of the first scratchings of actual security permeating the marketplace and starting at, the big companies using it, but not all of them. Not all of them. All right. Well, enough on that topic. Just give you an update from the Spark Studio Salem with the local makerspace that I'm a part of, and let you know that we've started having some regular 1 p.m. Saturday work parties. The first one went amazing. The second one tried to reproduce what happened at the first one, and it didn't work. A lot of projects that were continuing, and the fact that not the same people showed up made it hard to continue on some projects. So, a little mental note on that next time around. Just, for that kind of thing, we'll try to just, start new projects. And any follow-up projects, do some planning between meetings to, make sure that we have the means to continue and just not bother if we don't. But anyway, for more on what we're doing there, you can go to sparkstudiosalem.com. That's our blog. I'll need to update it. We had an article come out in the salemreporter.com that was kind of fun, where they kind of picked up on my tagline of makerspaces as a shared mad scientist garage. So they ran with something like that as the title. But I think they did a really good job of capturing the spirit of makerspaces and why they're a good thing in your community. It's something, for the most part, I've seen that describing a makerspace to someone is not real effective. It's when you've actually been in one that it's like, oh, wow, this is cool. This is something, yeah, I definitely want to have something like this I can go to. So just a little update on that. And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. I'm Dave Duncan, joined today by independent historian James Masnove. Hello, James.
Hello.
So today we were kind of looking through the litany of good stories and came across this one, The Rise of the Worker Productivity Score. So I'll just kind of hit some highlights here. We were both reading it, but this was really just discussing the chickenization, if that's a phrase you're familiar with, where the large companies, the buyers, would set all the rules for the chicken breeders on, what, sort of conditions they needed, and what the prices would be, and all the feed they should use, and all this, while sort of maintaining the fiction that they were independent contractors and being worked at the bare subsistence level because they had that monopsony power of being able to set the price and terms for everything. And of course, we've heard a lot about the Amazon warehouse workers who had, their time off task rather viciously measured, such that people were using bottles instead of bathrooms because they just couldn't afford that much time off task. And especially given the amount of security processing they had to go through to get in and out of the warehouse floor, make sure they weren't walking off with products, I expect. But rise of worker productivity score was how this is being taken now into professional environments. And their lead example was a finance executive, senior vice president, comped at $200 an hour, but she noticed her paychecks were low because the measuring systems were very minute in what they considered work time, and doing things like math problems on paper and reading printouts and thinking were things that were not counted as payable hours. They had a lot of other examples. Radiologists having scoreboards showing their inactivity time and how their productivity stacks up against their colleagues. The time white collar workers described being tracked as demoralizing, humiliating, and toxic. Micromanagement is becoming standard. United Health social workers were marked idle for lack of keyboard activity while counseling patients in drug treatment facilities. Grocery cashiers said the pressure to quickly scan items degraded customer service, making it harder to be patient with elderly shoppers who move slowly. We're in the era of measurement, but we don't know what we should be measuring, said Ryan Fuller, a former vice president of workplace intelligence at Microsoft.
On that last note, that we don't know what we should be measuring, I think that says a lot right there, because what about the person-to-person experience? Not only the time shift with somebody who's elderly or something like that, but also these metrics seem to discount or not take into account, especially in the service industry, the importance of making yourself available to a customer in a sort of, something resembling a human way.
Yeah.
And it's just very telling. I also wanted to note that something that I thought was interesting in that article is how this is discussing work. Both, you would expect maybe this to be a phenomenon in remote work, and it's certainly growing because of that, especially in the post-pandemic world, the way remote work has become even more ubiquitous, but that these metrics are also being applied at people who still work in an office. And so people should not think that they're somehow being kept from this sort of surveillance, because it could be happening in an office that you might think they wouldn't bother with it because you're showing up in person.
The one thing the boss notoriously does, which is walk around the office staring over your shoulder, has now been automated. So he can just drink coffee and watch the little red indicators pop up and push the button saying bad boy.
Exactly.
And I think this is a problem with technology in general, of don't let the fact that you don't know what you're doing stop you from doing it. And experimenting on people. This is I think this is an example of the leveraging power of technology being used to strip away dignity and humanity with very questionable returns on the other side. There were some comments of, hey, this had some productivity gains, and if you're not doing it, then you're being left behind. And a lot of times that's short-term thinking. I recall an article that was talking about people being so sensitive to changes in their environment that you could increase productivity by removing one fluorescent light or something, and then you increase productivity again by putting it back. Just like people are stimulated by change and attention. And I think we're sort of naturally as a pack species, we're to a large degree driven by the attention and value others put on us. And I think machine monitoring sometimes presses those buttons to a ruthless and unnatural degree that really can cause some long-term problems.
Absolutely. And I feel like this is merely the beginning of a problem that's just going to grow. I come from an academic sort of world, and there's this growing field of online academic tutoring and teaching. And I've certainly had my fair share of that kind of work. And there are agencies that, and I have nothing bad to say about any of them, but are known to do this kind of tracking. And there's all sorts of issues. So there's the side. Now, most of my academic tutoring work has been at the college level. So this is a little bit different from some of the immediate concerns I would have when you are talking about like school age children, minors, and the sort of what kind of data mining might be happening with these kinds of services in terms of pulling information from the activities of children online. That's one side of it.
There's also the remote invigilation software for remote testing that is just part of this stuff of, hey, if you can get people used to something in school, they won't be shocked when they encounter it in the workplace.
Oh, that's a very good point. Yeah, and then there's the professional side of it, which came to mind when I was looking at this article as well, which is this seems to be these sorts of metrics to me in terms of people not getting paid for, if they cannot prove that they were working online at a given time, unless they're being paid salary, if by contract they're a wage worker, I don't see how that's not a violation of their labor rights.
Yeah, I think it would have to be. And they also talked in there about sometimes the law not catching up with the technology. This is obviously, all the laws are written in a very different environment, but I think sometimes people rush ahead and just say, well, I'm just doing this. And
yes,
if you're stealing in a new way, it doesn't get picked up right away as stealing, but that's what it is. If someone is at work, thinking about work, talking with colleagues, scratching stuff out on paper, I think one, saying that, beyond just being a flaw in the technology, that maybe some people would not consider that work, but everything about humans ebbs and flows. You
right.
can't have hot moments of high concentration without a little downtime. You're going to burn people up if you make them act like a machine when they're not a machine.
Oh, absolutely. A fair amount of my work is I evaluate academic essays, and I think some people might see that as like a really cushy job, and yeah, you sit at a desk and you do this, but it is laborious on your brain. Like, and it kind of doesn't matter whether you're looking at a high quality essay or a low quality essay. Arguably, the lower quality essays are even harder to evaluate. But it is a grind like anything else. A job is a job. And what this other thing that came to mind to me is that there's some irony in this sort of work, whether you're talking about whether it's technically hourly or salary. But when you have people in this article talking about that they're working 50, 60 hours a week in order to prove, quote unquote, prove that they're 40 hours a week. And yet I know, because I've done work that uses these kinds of online metrics at times, that the irony of that is that you don't get away from your job in the same way, because this kind of work, you're inundated with work emails constantly. And even if you shut off notifications on your phone or whatever, you're so inundated with work stuff, even at those times that you should be allowed to get away from it psychologically. But as soon as you check your email to check up on other things, you're inundated with 10, 20, 30 work-related emails that you should not be bothered with. When you're not, quote unquote, on the clock. But that's the irony, is that people are working more in order to prove that they're working. And then on top of that, they're being inundated while they're not working with work-related information and requests.
That around the world, there is some movement in updating labor laws to include the right to turn off your phone. That you're not allowed to have any contact with work-related contact with an employee outside of the hours they're being paid.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that could be mitigated relatively easily through like work related apps that turn off once you're off the clock or what have you. Those are the sorts of things that could be mitigated, but obviously companies don't want that.
Yeah. And there's a sort of a Russian roulette aspect to this too, where some of the monitoring systems involve kind of random samplings. And so if you happen to be scratching an itch or taking a drink at the time, that's the shot that gets you. And it's what's that mental exercise, the panopticon, where you're only being monitored some of the time, but you feel like you're being watched all of the time.
Yeah.
Leveraging the surveillance apparati, I guess.
Right.
So that's not much better.
Right. And even if you're just kind of by nature a productive and efficient worker and you like to stay on task and all of those things, just knowing that you're potentially being watched at all times, or you don't know when you are not, that has a psychological weight to it, no matter how good your work is.
Yeah. There was I think in the general corpus of discussions about the corrosive effect of surveillance, that you're not free to discover anything about yourself if you're constantly being surveilled, and you have to be able to, you can't just try on ideas if you're going to be held to account for every syllable you say. And right. To a lesser degree, I think that applies to your work life, that you can't really figure out how to do better ways to do your job if your any experimentation is marked off as wasted time. You may find something that's a 10x improvement, but you're never going to get there because you're not allowed to.
Whether you're talking on at the professional level, like this article talks about, or just more generally in the culture, it feels like there's a push from where, I don't know, from capitalism. They want you to feel like you're always being watched, so that you can sort of keep yourself in check in a strange way. And it's very bizarre. It's Orwellian. That to say something as Orwellian has become so common now that it's practically a cliche.
We need new words that are put it a little more strongly, like right. Or Orwell was a piker. It's like it's right. so much worse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think there's also a implicit classism and inequality that is being increased by this kind of thing, because I would love to see the employees having this kind of monitoring of their boss, seeing how much time he's spending drinking coffee or chatting, and see how well that goes over.
Right.
Maybe there'd be a little more empathy, because there's always this sense of those lazy employees. They're for some people, their whole sense of what their job as a manager is to keep these lazy bastards in line, and it just sort of bypassing, and of course forgiving anything that they do as a well-deserved creative break, and the consistency is not there and the value is not there. I think measuring can be useful. It just needs to not be at such a micro scale that it causes a sort of problems. Or maybe it should be something run into an AI and the feedback goes to the employee. I think people really underestimate, in the abstract, how much people want to do a good job.
Yeah, well, I feel like in the broader sense, we're also talking about things that have, in actuality, some real Fourth Amendment privacy implications that I think will eventually get there. I don't think we're there yet, because I don't think enough people are thinking this way necessarily. But it reminds me of a similarly First Amendment issue, which is, in the United States, protected speech is, at a high level for the most part. And Brandenburg v. Ohio is the most relevant standing case law from 1969, which is that even advocating for violence in the abstract is protected speech. What you cannot do is target and make your comments immediate and specific.
Right.
But even then, there are exceptions to that, because you can make an abstract threat to a human being, and if you do it once, it's protected speech. But if you do it repeatedly, it's harassment, and it's no longer protected. And harassment has a certain bar that once you reach it, your speech is no longer protected, because you're using it in a sense as a form of intimidation. And I think as this stuff continues, I think this sort of like inundation of emails and notifications from one's employer and things like that may start to go into the realm of Fourth Amendment violations of the right of privacy, and like what you were talking about earlier, what other countries have proposed of separating the employee from the employer at a given time of day. I do think that's going to be required, at least as a conversation.
I think there will probably also be some cases where some ham-handed supervisors inquiring about people's bathroom habits will be taken as some sort of harassment.
Yes.
Especially if it's not across the board, how much they micromanage that. I could see them saying, you know, oh, these women are taking too long in the bathroom, and just giving the guys a pass. That's,
right.
You know, kind of problem. And maybe you could fill in some background law on this. I do recall there was you know, early days of computers and extended electronic capabilities, where it became possible and easy technically to monitor phone calls, and that was you know, like say someone's wife is calling him, or spouse is calling him, and that was ruled as inappropriate invasion of privacy. Is that do you recall something regarding that?
Yeah, I don't know this specific case or series of cases by name, but yeah, like you said, people, you know, sometimes it's the private sector, sometimes it's government, but suddenly they're capable of doing something, and there's no infrastructure to stop them, and so they just do it. You combine that with shifting sensibilities in the culture. So early telephone, let's say in the 1930s, right? Franklin Roosevelt, across the board, across the nation, tapped all sorts of people's phones, largely because of the World War II effort. But there was no infrastructure saying that it was a violation of people's privacy or speech rights to do so. So, you know, it was another case of the law having to catch up to the technology. In that case, it had to deal with government power versus private sector interest, but it's the same sort of phenomenon. Yeah. And yeah, eventually the law and the sensibilities of, well, what is private speech? And, you know, should the government just automatically be able to tap somebody's phone without a warrant and things like that? You know, eventually we kind of got our hands around that. But this is what happens over and over and over again. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because what we're talking about today with this stuff is kind of a parallel to that.
And on a tech angle here, my sample size of 5 or something sort of experience is, it seems that the sorts of providers of surveillance solutions like this, the kinds of people that think that's a great idea tend to be the kinds of people that don't write very good software, or at least they care so little for their customers as they do the people being surveilled, that they make it good enough to sell, but not necessarily good enough to work. For example, with the invigilation software, there was stuff with people doing a panoramic photo, and when the system wanted to see their room and all that, they just wave it across the photo, or have a photo in front of the camera so it always looked like the person was there. I'm reminded also of someone who used the green screen background, virtual background feature on Zoom to do a loop of themselves just sitting there and kind of nodding a little bit, and then they could turn on that virtual background and step out of the frame, and no one would know that they weren't there. So you have that sort of thing. I think if you extend that to deep fake technology, where
Mhm.
you have the ability to sort of puppeteer an image that may or may not be you, but could be. You could have an entire virtual environment that your software was monitoring, and it's sitting there very diligently working. Maybe taking just enough breaks to be credible, and leaving you free to actually do your job.
Yeah, there's something else I came across just recently that our discussion is reminding me of. And I think you had mentioned something about like online, like proctored tests or something
Yeah.
earlier. Are you familiar with that recent court decision? I think it's out of the district in Ohio, but it had to do with the, let me see, what was it? It was the Cleveland State University was sued because of their use of what are called room scans for these. The way they would proctor online tests is they would
You have to wave the camera around to show no one else is in the room.
right.
Yeah.
Well, a student from when this happened to a student in 2021, they challenged it, and a lower court has just ruled that is indeed a violation of the Fourth Amendment. So it'll be interesting to see how that moves forward. But it's very similar to what we're talking about. Is that there's this this, I don't want to call it an indoctrination because I don't know that it's that top down. It's just sort of a culture that's developing of an expectation that people don't have a certain basic level of personal privacy, even in their own bedroom, in their own home.
Yeah, there were a couple of pretty offensive cases that, or at least troubling cases early on that, really kind of flavors this whole thing of extending this to all the workers. That there was cases where a student was, this is like a minor, a high school type student, was given tablets along with monitoring software, and the high school staff and faculty were using this to surreptitiously monitor kids working at home, where someone actually sent the police out after a kid because he thought he saw him, taking drugs, and he was eating Mike and Ike's, but it raised this whole capability that the parents weren't aware of, is that their children were being monitored in their house. And what about the parents' privacy? If nothing
Right.
else, they're in the same house. And so there was that. There was cases of people like having to go to bathroom in their chair because they were scared to get up and walk away from life determining tests. And there was also the misuse of this software. I mean, a lot of times tech comes with a disclaimer: please don't use it for the manner that you obviously will use it for.
Right.
And it was doing things like it would automatically, if someone's eyes shifted, or if it detected them saying something, like if they're singing to themselves or talking to themselves, it would set off a flag that the professor was then supposed to review the footage and determine if they were cheating, but instead just said, oh well, the software said you were cheating, so I'm marking you a 0. And some really heavy consequence comes from that kind of heavy-handed behavior. And again, it's this mismatch of either the tools being fit for purpose or the people using it being fit for purpose.
Yeah. Well, that and something you mentioned earlier about, maybe management and sort of the upper bosses should have this sort of put on them, and maybe there'd be some empathy there. It does bring up that question of who watches the watchman. It seems like we're creating a surveillance net. It's not only surveillance capitalism, because this also runs into publicly funded government and pseudo-government organizations like school districts, as well as state and federal government. And it's also creating a sort of surveillance class, which is bizarre, but it's maybe one of the things to be the most concerned about, is this who watches the watchman kind of thing.
Yeah, there's, that's always an issue. And, sometimes the answer to that question is Google, they outsource it to some large, supposedly trusted entity to, kind of wash all the responsibility away from them because if nothing else, how well someone will do if they go try to sue Google.
Right.
So yeah, I think the overall this is an example of a tech having, at least for the people implementing it, have a kind of a sexy factor. You know, this is going to give me more power, and more power is good, even if that power is ultimately being used in ways that are toxic to the targets and, to the user and to a large degree, because monitoring your fellow human like that is, I think, itself kind of a toxic experience.
Well, it is in any relationship, right? That old saying that familiarity breeds contempt. I think people understand what that means, because when you overly scrutinize somebody, even somebody that you care about, even somebody who's in your daily life, overly scrutinizing anybody breeds contempt, because why wouldn't it? Nobody wants to be put under a microscope like that. And then even more so if it's somebody that you're not personally invested in. What is this amorphous corporation, and what business is it of theirs? And yeah, there are legitimate business concerns of, companies don't want employees, wasting time and being inefficient, but these things have to be mitigated in a way that understands that we're always dealing with human beings here.
Yeah, the value of humans being human is something that sometimes gets lost track of. I recall people talking about, you really need to be, teach your kids to be polite to your automated assistant, because if they get used to being rude to something that is pretending to be, kind of human in its interface, that might transfer into how they treat, women, other humans, etc. And what you were saying earlier about the toxic effect on relationships, it reminds me of kind of some of the stats around police officers who have the issue of they go around all day being in a disproportionate level of control over, sometimes life and death over the people they encounter. And then they go home and they use those same skills of coercion and presumption on their spouse instead of communicating and dealing with issues. And
not to mention that those kinds of jobs draw those kinds of people in to begin with.
There is an amplification. Yeah, there's certainly.
And there's that side of it too. Do you remember? This is a little bit off track, but do you remember that story from several years ago that that it's possible to score too high on an IQ test in order to become a police officer?
Yeah.
And that ended up being protected or upheld, because the concern was a highly intelligent police officer probably won't be a police officer for very long.
Right. Yeah. The feeling was that you would get bored. And I think the other thing, just kind of having been on the inside of police culture a little bit, is they don't want anyone smart enough to be able to get away with anything.
Sure. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Sure.
They want their peers to be able to detect what they're doing, if nothing else. They may not ever have any sort of accountability for it, but they will at least get some nudges from their fellow officers from some of the worst behaviors, at least the worst ones relative to the organization, not necessarily to what the public would like for them.
Right.
All right. Well, this has been a great conversation as always, James. Thank you for joining me here once again. And let's remind people of your other hat you wear is as an author. So let us know books you've got out and what they're called.
Yeah, I have a book called History Killers and Other Essays by an Intellectual Historian. And my next book is An Intellectual History of the Supreme Court. And that'll be coming out in the next few months. And I also have a Substack called History Killers, historykillers.substack.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you, James, for joining us once again. And I look forward to the next time you're here.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. I'm Dave Duncan, and the better you understand technology, the better results you can have at home, at work, and in your civic engagements. Please join us to continue these conversations next Wednesday and every Wednesday, noon to 1 o'clock on Northwest Tech Show.